you a little bit more about sort of the rationale that brings us together for these these interesting papers and presentations today. If you're just joining, you'll see that we've invited people to introduce themselves in the chat. So please take a moment and tell us where you're coming from today, where you're joining from. This is a session dedicated to 3 background papers that were prepared as part of the Futures of Education initiative. It's co-organized by Teachers College, Columbia University, NISSEM, in partnership with UNESCO. And I want to start, and we'll do it at the end as well, just give thanks to Teachers College and the tech people who are making this possible. If we could go to the next slide, I want to go over a couple of technical housekeeping details. So Kim, if you could advance the slide. We have disabled microphones in this webinar. We'll be locking the chat box shortly and instead encouraging you to use the Q&A box. Kim, if you could advance the slide, that would be great. Vidur, can you come in? I'm not seeing that the slide is advancing.
Yeah, I don't see it advancing either. I'm not sure Kim can.
So didn't you see?
No, Kim, please just advance the slide, please.
I have seen here. So what do you mean by here advance? So it's
just move to the next slide, please.
Do you see next slide? No?
No.
Oh, I need to stop and share it again in that case.
Yeah, if you can just pause and yeah.
You see now?
I think it's coming up.
Did you see?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Vidur yet, no.
Oh, what happened? It's sharing here. Let me do this again.
As an alternative, Vidur, do you possibly have the ability to share the presentation?
I'm just going to try. Yeah, I'm just going to try that.
Thank you. So webinar housekeeping is a little bit of technical troubleshooting today. So we'll be using the Q&A for questions. Please feel free to put in questions or comments, disguised as questions, disguised as comments at any point, and we'll try and incorporate them. We'll built in the last half hour of the session for exchange, among the panelists and among the attendees. We'll also be launching some polls. So if you're familiar with Zoom, they're pretty easy to complete. And my final note is to just remind you that closed captioning is available. So if you go to the bottom of the Zoom screen and click on closed captioning, you should be able to see an AI generated captioning for this session. So if we could go to the next slide. Here's the plan for today. I'm gonna just take 1 or 2 minutes and talk about UNESCO's Futures of Education initiative, which is the overall framing for this conversation. Then we'll hear a presentation from Helen Haste and Vidur Chopra. We'll hear from Michele Schweisfurth, and then we'll hear from Jim Williams and Andy Smart. We also, if we can go to the next slide, have with us Enrique Chaux, from Colombia, who's going to be a discussant alongside me, responding to each of the presentations. So let's go to the next slide, and let me briefly just tell you about UNESCO's Futures of Education initiative, which follows in the footsteps of two previous white paper visioning reports, one that came out in the early 1970s, put together by a commission under the leadership of Edgar Faure, Learning to Be. You may be more familiar with the Delors report, which came out in 1996, Learning the Treasure Within. And basically, at regular, maybe roughly 25-year intervals, UNESCO has engaged in this kind of reflective exercise of examining the challenges and opportunities that we see in the present moment for the world, for education, and thinking forward about what we want to change, what we want to preserve, and what we want to do to shape the future in the ways that we want. This iteration also includes an international commission, in this case chaired by the President of Ethiopia, Madam Sahle-Work Zewde. She's joined by 17 other thought leaders from various fields from around the globe. And I think one thing that's maybe a bit different from the previous iterations of this exercise is that there's a very broad public consultation, public engagement process, and involvement from experts. In a second, one of my colleagues can put in the chat a link to the UNESCO Futures of Education website, and you can find out ways that you can get involved. But one of the ways that we involve people is by soliciting background papers from experts on some of the initial ideas that were identified by the International Commission as key priorities. There have been 3 publications that have come out so far. The first was a visioning and framing document that actually came out in February of 2020, and the 3 presentations that you'll hear today are based on papers that responded to that initial document. I'll just add quickly that since then, the Commission released a statement on COVID and the educational response, and also a more elaborated report that came out in June called Education in a Post-COVID World, 9 Ideas for Public Action. So again, we'll put up the links to those in the chat. So without further ado, I want to turn the floor over to Helen and Vidur to talk about their paper on uncertainty, ambiguity, and participation in the futures of education. So over to you, Helen and Vidur.
Thank you, Noah. I just unmuted myself, right. Good, thank you. Well, first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm from the University of Bath, Emeritus Professor there, and Vidur will introduce himself when he takes over halfway through. He has been a major person in the organization of this event, so I want to thank him. I also want to thank all of you from all over the world for spending time to come and join us at this exciting webinar, particularly at the time of international uncertainty and disruption and constrictions of various sorts. So anyway, we're talking about change, and we in our paper particularly going to talk about the nature of change and how we need to think about change. We're thinking as far ahead as 2030, which is 30 years away. 2050, I'm sorry, 2050, 30 years away. And we need to bear in mind that when we are engaging in any kind of future gazing, we're doing prediction and prescription, what will happen, what ought to happen. And we generally fail at this quite miserably because we almost invariably project more of the same onto the future. We take today's problems, and we think today's solutions to the problems, and we tend to project them onto the future. What we want to argue is that we have to think differently about it if we want to be effective in the future. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, so if you try to understand change and to create effective predictions and prescriptions, let's think of some examples. In the last year, we've had the most amazing experiences of sudden and unpredicted change. COVID-19 and also changing ways of thinking about climate change alerted us to the danger of assuming more of the same. They made us think differently, made us realize that our assumptions were not appropriate. We were inadequately prepared for, in fact, totally unprepared for the pandemic of COVID. And we were thinking differently about climate change. We realized that climate change isn't something slow and progressive that we might alter, but it's a sudden cataclysmic effect. Awareness, for example, that there will be a number of cities will be underwater if climate change continues in the present route. Calcutta, Ho Chi Minh City, Rangoon, Miami will all be underwater if climate change isn't resolved. Technology is also not the only factor in change. We hear a lot of conversations about how technology affects change, but actually technology is not the only issue. And particularly, change is not always linear and progressive. It's often rupturing or cataclysmic. And we have tended to think about change as a progressive linear process optimistically, perhaps for the last 30 or so years. But actually, we're now seeing that change is very frequently rupturing, catastrophic, cataclysmic. We only have to think about yesterday in Washington, for example, a very surprising, to say the least, event. So what will the effective citizen of 2050 actually need? We argue that they need to be prepared for uncertainty, prepared for ambiguity, prepared for complexity, and they're going to need particular skills, particular mindsets, and adaptability to do this. Next slide, please. So also need to bear in mind that change is not equally distributed. Uncertainty is different in the global north and the global south. The global south, in a sense, always live with uncertainty. The global north pretends it doesn't exist. Technological innovation has different consequences and different adaptations in different parts of the world. Political upheaval is different in different parts of the world and has different consequences. A democratic society in upheaval is different from a society in an autocratic state. And I've said climate change and adaptations to reduce it have different consequences and different implications. We cannot assume as a universal one problem or even one solution fits all. Next slide, please. So we're going to argue that there are three kinds of futures, which is said by an American politician, but actually goes back many, many centuries to, I think, a Persian argument, that we have known knowns, things we know are going to happen and predict them, known unknowns, we know something's going to happen, we don't know quite what, but we know it's going to be unknown. And we've got the unknown unknowns. We do not know what is going to happen, we don't expect it, we have no way of anticipating it. And when we're thinking about the future, we have to bear in mind that the unknown unknowns are the key things that might really affect us. I want to argue there are three kinds of change and therefore three implications for prediction. There's some kind of change is more of the same. Things will be pretty much like they are today, but with maybe a few tweaks, technological or whatever, but basically we can predict from the present with reasonable confidence. Then we have quantity into quality. That's where things change in a sort of cumulative way, and ultimately there's a qualitative difference. For example, a village becomes a town as it grows, becomes a city as it grows. A city is qualitatively different in many, many ways from a village, but it's a gradual process, but the process of change causes eventually qualitative change. And then the third kind of change is what one of my colleagues called Knight's moves, like in chess, like that, or indeed ruptures, a sudden change, a dramatic change, a fundamental change. And these are very different and very, it's almost impossible to predict what happens in a Knight's move. Yet Knight's moves are the things that really fundamentally change our whole way of life, our whole way of living, our whole way of coping with the world. So let's have the next slide, please. So let's look at what happens in Knight's moves and ruptures. Well, first of all, the underlying narratives and explanations, how we make sense of the world, how we tell stories of what we'd like to happen, our predictions and our prescriptions are going to change because they are fundamentally undermined, modified, destroyed, created. What we take for granted as certain is going to change. We can no longer assume the same things we used to assume. The values we hold and the priorities we have for practice change as a consequence. And also our goals. We tend to think of the future in terms of utopias and dystopias. One of the effects of a night's move or a rupture is that these change. They have to be changed to meet the changing circumstances. And of course, they change our projections for the future, what we're aiming for. And in all this, the skills that we're going to need will be altered by night's moves. Obvious night's moves include, for example, the invention of the microchip, which has totally transformed every single area of our lives, certainly in my lifetime, and even in the lifetimes of people a lot younger than me. And major events of a variety of sorts, political, social, economic, and of course, geographical, have an effect. So I'm going to pass now to Vidur, who's going to talk about some examples. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. I'm Vidur. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Teachers College, Columbia University. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this framework that we've thought about for change in the context of forced migration. And we look at forced migration because of multiple reasons, but one of the reasons that it's extremely hard to sort of forecast what is going to happen to migration levels in the next 30 years. But there are sort of two scenarios that we can at least think of based on what we know right now, as imperfect as they may be as we forecast into the future. The first is this idea that with rising climate change and sort of the rise of pseudo-autocracies, there are going to be increased aspirations or reasons for people to move and for mobility. Now, as those aspirations increase and rise, we also acknowledge the fact that some of those aspirations may be unrealized, or there might be cases of failed migration where people are unable to move or try to move, but fail in their attempts for mobility. And in those contexts, there's going to be increased sort of frustration among people and the kinds of social contracts that they're able to develop with governments, with one another, with the state. And so that fundamentally changes the relationship that individuals have with the state, and education has a clear role to play in that, in thinking about what are the kinds of relationships that it is able to forge. The next piece that we think about is oftentimes we consider migration to be linear as movement from point A to point B. But based on what we know about contemporary migration, particularly in the context of forced displacement, it's not often linear, but often cyclical, continuous, ongoing. And that means that children are often going to move through multiple education cycles, through multiple contexts, and each of those contexts vary greatly. And what those contexts, the settings are, the context of reception within each of those settings are also going to have a bearing on the ways individuals come to think about themselves, their identities, their roles in societies, and how they form sort of membership and belonging. Now, one of the big shifts that we've seen in education for refugees or in the context of forced migration is the idea of inclusion, or including refugees into national systems of education. And while this idea of inclusion exists in policy, we see in practice that it does not, in fact, enable full membership for young people within societies, which precludes their abilities to be able to participate. So whether that be in terms of employment or in terms of sort of civic engagement. And so there are real clear sort of important implications for civic education and education more broadly. Now, we also acknowledge that curricula and pedagogy are often tethered to nation states, and they're hugely political decisions about what is taught, who's taught, how people are taught. And if we were to think about forced migration within this framework that we just introduced, so if we thought of a more of the same, we could say that migrations pretty much going to stay the same. There's just a small proportion of the world's population that actually moves. And so it doesn't really matter what much, and education doesn't have anything to do with it. If we thought about the idea of quantity into quality, we would say, we might think of this idea of inclusion, but it's still pretty much business as usual. On the other hand, a ruptures move would really be thinking about if migration is in fact going to be a reality or a construct of the future, then what does it mean for education to be able to create opportunities for transferable, credentialed credits and skills that people can take with them as they move, but also for curriculum and pedagogy to be able to acknowledge individuals' multiple identities and multiple mobilities. So as we think about these ideas, we're sort of forced to think about what does that really mean for education right now in terms of preparing for education for the future 30 years from now. One of the big challenges that I think we all sort of stumble up against is that there is hardly any time for meaningful social studies curricula, particularly as we think about civic education in the context of this work, or for ideas of sort of perspective taking, deliberation, for acknowledging parallel and multiple perspectives to exist in tension with one another in classrooms and even in textbooks for that matter. As we think about technology and the surveilling state and the kinds of risks that brings for young people in how they decide to engage within their societies or not, or hold back. We need to think about the ways education is able to create the kinds of skills and protective structures, whether emotional, interpersonal, psychological, that where they can hold governments and private actors accountable for the kinds of data harvesting that we're seeing that is often exploitative. And so in that case, the idea about education is really thinking about how are young people able to manage ambiguity and the kinds of anxiety and risks that might be brought about by these ruptures, knowing that change is often sort of induces some of these tensions that we might be very uncomfortable with, but have to wrestle with and come to terms with. And the last piece, we really want to think about this idea of narratives and counter narratives and scenario building, and the role of utopias and dystopias as sort of literary tools that can be used in different sort of subjects or in different classroom settings that are able to provide young people with a vision or an imaginary that can inspire them to act, but also to reflect on their current values and current contexts that may enable or preclude this kind of participation that we hope that the citizen of 2050 is able to think about. And so as we think about 2050, this is not just about a shift in values, but really a fundamental rethinking of these explanations and ideas of causality, of consequence, of being able to think differently and quickly, often in the lack of clear evidence. And for all of this, we believe that social studies particularly has a really important role to play in the ways that we're creating the citizen of 2050 and beyond. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen and Vidur. Excellent work taking us through the key points in your paper. We just put it in the chat, a reminder that these presentations are based on full background papers, and you'll see as the session unfolds today how they relate to one another. So we're going to go over and just quickly do a poll before we go over to Enrique for some comments. So Vidur, can you launch that? Great. So you should have seen a poll pop up on the screen in front of you. We're going to give you maybe half a minute to identify. It's hard. Pick one. What do you think will be the greatest challenge in your society in 2050? Please take just one more, maybe 10 more seconds. We've got about 2/3 of the 150 of you that are in the audience today. We've completed this so far. We'll give you one more minute here. Or not a minute, sorry, just a couple seconds. All right, so you should see the results up on the screen in front of you. What do you think in this group? Global inequality and injustice comes followed closely by climate challenge and environmental crises. Yeah, interesting. Thanks for that. I'm reminded of Helen's comment that there are known unknowns, unknown unknowns. Maybe over to Enrique now to maybe briefly introduce yourself and offer some thoughts on this piece.
Hello everyone, I'm Enrique Chaux. I'm from Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. And I had the pleasure of reading the 3 papers and prepare some responses. And I think they all make wonderful contributions. I want to first congratulate Helen and Vidur for great thoughts about the future. Thinking about the future is very hard. especially now that we know that the future changes so quickly and it's hard to anticipate what is going to happen. So I also appreciate that they don't make specific predictions, but they create a framework to think about the future. And I think that's very useful. And also because it gives some suggestions about what to do in education. For example, prepare students for dealing with ambiguity. And when I was reading, I kept thinking about another possible change that will probably come very soon, and which is the relation we have as a species to the other species that we share the world with the other animals. And it's mentioned very quickly at the end of the paper, but I think it's something that we might be seeing fundamental changes in the next years. And something that they didn't present in the presentation, but it's in the paper, and I think it's very usual, is that they created, Helen and Vidur created stages, 6 stages of changes, of how they large changes in society come about. And the first one is, if I remember correctly, is that there is scientific knowledge that something should be changed, but that knowledge is not known all over. So only experts know the data that is showing that change is important and is coming. And in the second phase, second stage, there are already groups asking for the change, but there is resistance among many groups and cultures and political groups, resistance to the change. And I think that probably the issues related to animal rights and animal welfare are probably in those first 2. There are a lot of scientific reasons for changing the way we relate to animals, related to how animals are able to feel pain or an animal consciousness. And there are scientific reasons related to climate change and the impact that the huge animal farms have on the climate. Is a good reason for concern. And another one is a possible next pandemic that might come from animal factories where animals are receiving huge doses of antibiotics and creating the possibility of resistance to antibiotics. So that is already bringing a lot of concern in scientific community and also concern in young population. And we're already seeing some of the changes that that we might be dealing with in next years. And so thinking about Helen and Vidur's paper, they suggest that students should be prepared to deal with those uncertain difficulties, to the dealing with the ambiguities. So I was thinking maybe we should start right now bringing more and more moral dilemmas, for example, or role plays with conflicts about how to deal with difficult issues related to animal rights, and that will help students start becoming more prepared for those difficult situations, because I'm sure there are going to be more and more conflicts between generations. We're already seeing some conflicts between young children and adolescents who, for example, want to be vegan, and their parents don't like the idea, and there are already conflicts between generations, but also between cultures, within cultures. So it will be, it's like a very interesting opportunity to start working on those skills to deal with ambiguity, to deal with the conflicts, to deal with the difficult dilemmas and conflicts that are going to be happening. So I really appreciate the framework that they given us. And I think we can think about new topics, new issues. They mention migration, they mention climate change, they mention communication, I mentioned animal rights, and I think there are many more in which we can envision that change and ambiguity is coming, and we should start working on that right now. So congratulations again.
Thanks very much, Enrique. Before we go to Michele, let me just ask a quick question, just a clarifying question that came up in the chat. Vidur and Helen, what did you mean that there's little or no time for social studies curricula? Can you just quickly come in on that, one of you?
Sure. I think that is more in the context of just thinking of the way sort of curriculum and timetables are organized in schools and education systems, where often social studies is right at the bottom of the sort of the priority list. And so we see that there's, oftentimes just like one 40-minute subject and then entire week for a classroom to engage in any sort of conversation around sort of civics or society and the kinds of dilemmas that young people confront on an ongoing basis in their societies, but often don't even make it into the official curriculum or the kinds of pedagogies that teachers might adopt in the classroom, as well as thinking about the hidden curriculum that exists in the classroom in addition to the formal one.
Got it. Or the kind of dilemmas that Enrique was just raising as
that's right.
For classroom conversation. Excellent. Okay, thanks. So we'll go to the next presentation. Michele is going to take us, continue this discussion of change and ambiguity, certainty and uncertainty, but with specific reference to pedagogy now. Over to you, Michele.
Thanks very much, Noah, and thanks to everybody out there. I can't see you, but I'm very grateful that you made the time to come along today, wherever you are, whether it's morning or afternoon or evening or the middle of the night, but thank you for coming. Yes, I'm Michele Schweisfurth. I'm from the School of Education at the University of Glasgow, and I'm going to be talking today about future pedagogies, emphasis on the plural, reconciling multifaceted realities and shared visions. And before I proceed, I'd just like to say a little bit about what I mean by pedagogy. I think that people tend to think of pedagogy as observable practice, so teaching methods that teachers use. But I like Robin Alexander's take on pedagogy, which sets out pedagogy as not only what is observable, but also what is behind it. So the philosophies, the beliefs, the policies that affect individual teachers and that also create pedagogical patterns within and across different cultures. So next slide, please. So the Futures of Education has some principles that they have set out, which are very relevant to pedagogy. Now, obviously the Futures of Education, their ideas are evolving, but these were set out in early documents. And so it's worth thinking about them as underpinning principles and thinking about whether they create a coherent framework for pedagogy. So the Futures of Education early documents describe knowledge as fluid, learners as active creators designing and determining their own education pathways, and democratic participation in education as including freedom of thought and expression. It also describes learning as a social endeavor defined by context in a plural social world. So the question I'd like to explore is, are there tensions between these? I would argue that there actually are. So much of what we see happening in classrooms actually has a lot behind it that is deeply entwined with culture. So in some cultures, the concept of knowledge as fluid is rather alien, and knowledge, at least some kinds of knowledge, is not questionable. Also, teachers and other elders can't be questioned because that is the nature of the culture where respect for elders is a deeply ingrained cultural value. And learners may not see individual autonomy as a goal to attain, And in some schools, they may be happy to or have to follow the pathways that are set out for them. So this, I believe, creates something of a paradox. If we accept these culturally plural realities, can we also prescribe particular visions of education for the future that do not align with them? Next slide, please. So in thinking about this, thinking about how we can try to reconcile these potentially contradictory positions, one way I think is helpful is not to think of these visions as absolutes, but to think of them as continua from one extreme to another. So each individual classroom and cumulatively each nation or other unit would fit somewhere on that scale. So for example, in a given society, knowledge may be seen as more fixed, or it may be seen as more fluid and questionable. Actually, I have to say, in the last 24 hours, my position on this has hardened a little bit. Some knowledge is not as fluid as some people would like to believe, right? Votes are counted, outcomes, there are winners and losers. It's not up for question. However, I digress. So somewhere along that continuum, and that is deeply going to affect pedagogy, right? If people believe that knowledge is fixed, then content is fixed and not questionable. And if it's fluid, then that opens up a whole set of doors about how we operate in classrooms. But most teachers will be somewhere in between and may even switch depending on the different disciplines that they teach or the day of the week. Next slide, please. Another one of these continua is learner autonomy. Again, rather than putting this as black and white, where learners are autonomous or not, I think it's helpful to think of this as a question of degree. So on one level, this is about the sense of the self as autonomous from others or from the wider world. And this is not a universal value. In some more collectivist cultures, people do not necessarily see their learning as individual. They see it as much more embedded in the learning and the learning success of others. An interdependent sense of self is a deeply held value and worldview in many cultures. Another aspect of this relates specifically to learners and their right to choose an individualized path through their learning journey. And again, there may be differences in different disciplines. So for example, in the arts, there may be more space to set one's own agenda, but perhaps less so in other subjects. And in some countries, you may need to earn the right to set your own learning agenda by demonstrating that you use those freedoms wisely. So this intersects with questions of power in learning spaces, which is the next continuum. Next slide, please. And this has to do with classroom relationships. So power, participation, relationships ranging again along a continuum from authoritarian relationships to democratic ones. And again, I would argue that a lot of teachers might see themselves behaving in different ways, even within the same 1 hour lesson, but also that different cultures will find it more tolerable to have different levels of authority relationships between teachers and learners. It's also extremely important to distinguish between authoritative teachers and authoritarian teachers. Authoritative teachers have a lot of subject knowledge, which is, of course, a desirable thing, while authoritarian teachers keep tight control over behaviors. So one may be more acceptable than others in different contexts and more desirable. Next slide, please. So if we think about these visions of pedagogy as continua, as culturally relative, that has a number of advantages. First of all, it respects that these visions may have different cultural expressions. It allows, if it is culturally acceptable, and that's another big debate, to move in the direction of that principle and make space for thinking not just about where we want to be, what steps it will take to get there. So not think, well, are we autonomous or are we not? It's about where are we? Where do we want to be? How do we get from here to there? It accounts for progression, therefore, in a direction of change. And it's pragmatic. A lot of my own research has been on learner-centered pedagogy, which shares these principles with the Futures of Education principles. And there is a spectacular overriding story of challenge in trying to move pedagogy in the direction of learner-centeredness. And this is virtually a universal phenomenon. Learner-centered pedagogy has been a traveling policy for many, many years, extremely influential, and yet that policy lever does not often change dramatically what happens in classrooms. Pedagogy is very resilient. There are fewer Knight's moves, as Helen and Vidur would say, in pedagogy than we might imagine. It's also worth noting that that there is quite a lot of evidence, for example, the work of Robert Sternberg, that learning happens more readily when the process aligns with cultural expectations. So dissonance between home and school don't help. So if schools are pushing for a particular pedagogy that is very much at odds with the values of the home, that's going to create dissonance. That's going to create problems. Next slide, please. So does that mean, therefore, that pedagogy is entirely culturally relative and there's no good pedagogy, there's no bad pedagogy, and there should be no guiding principles? No, absolutely not. There are dangers to absolute relativity. Some things are not okay and some are not evidence to help learning in any context. So some practices, for example, violate human and child rights. Teachers in some contexts may be greater authorities of all kinds than others, but relationships will always need to be governed by mutual respect, and random or cruel physical or emotional punishments are never okay. And the child rights conventions and human rights conventions give us a nice framework for thinking about those red lines. You know, okay, maybe you don't have to be so far along the democratic continuum, but if you're stretching so far into authoritarianism, you've crossed the line. And we also have to remember that some practices simply do not help children anywhere to learn, whatever cultural differences we have. We do have some basic cognitive similarities. So for example, teaching curriculum that is out of the reach of children and simply just plowing through it will not help learners to learn. And if teachers don't pay attention to the real life experiences of students, those students will not learn well. So we do need some principles, and UNESCO is well placed to set the agenda. But I'm saying we need some minimum standards. We need to think about, you know, what is flexible and what is not. I'm just going to close with just a little personal note. I sometimes feel like I'm very, very boring because I'm always dwelling on the gray areas. I'm always, you know, people set out visions, people set out manifestos, and I'm always saying, yeah, but well, it's a little bit this, it's a little bit that. But I think that these beautiful visions that are set out so poetically, I'm not aiming to knock them down, but I do think we need some nuance if we actually are going to improve pedagogy within the real world where cultural difference will frame it as well as wider principles. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Michele. Appreciate that. Before we go over to Enrique, we've got another poll. We'll just take half a minute. If you could launch it, Vidur, that would be great. On pedagogical perception. So which of the following reflect pedagogical beliefs widely held in the society in which you're most familiar? Pick one. Sorry, pick one. Take about 15 more seconds here. About half of the 150 of you here have answered so far. Okay, interesting. Maybe Vidur, you can close it and share it. So all of the above wins. I'm tempted to ask Michele whether you're surprised or not, what you expected, but let's first give Enrique a chance to come in with some comments, and then we'll make sure there's time for you to both respond to him and add anything you want to, Michele. Over to you, Enrique.
Well, I would like to first congratulate Michele for wonderful paper. I think I really appreciate the great areas and the nuances that you mentioned. I think it's crucial to take some perspective and understand that we cannot think of an ideal, unique way of working all over. And there's actually a real dilemma between what many of us working in education really agree on, some principles about pedagogy and pluralism. And we have to understand that there are cultural differences, and in some places, what we think is what will work best for students are not what people are, or most people will be willing to accept quickly, and they will feel it as a threat to many values that they have shared for a long time. So there's actually a real dilemma there, and I think it's important to think about it and to think about ways of dealing with that dilemma. And it reminds me of a similar dilemma we have had in Colombia, my country, dealing with the great diversity that we have. And we have a huge diversity. We have many indigenous cultures. We have urban, suburban, rural, inurban. We have subcultures. And in some of these places, for example, violence is actually accepted. Sometimes it's accepted as a way of for example, educating children, like so a way of parents to educate children. So we also had that dilemma, and the way we finally dealt with it was it was somewhat difficult for me to accept it at first, but it's similar to the red lines that you were mentioning. We decided that human rights are above all the possible diversities, in terms that diversity cannot be used as an excuse to violate human rights. So diversity cannot be used as an excuse to legitimize violence, for example. So what we also thought, what we have been trying to promote is to promote change, but taking into account the way the cultures and the subcultures understand what is right and what is not. And also, we have been very careful not to impose something from outside. But for example, if we want to promote some change in the way parents relate to children, or in terms of intra-family relations, for example, we need to work with people from the groups where we're working with, who can become allies, who can be that we can create local alliances, that we can work together. Because if no one from the group is having the voice of change, we cannot bring change from outside. But if we have some local alliances, sometimes groups of victims, for example, if we're working on issues of violence, who are asking for change from within, then it makes all the sense to bring support to those groups from outside. So in a way that might be similar in terms of education. If there are some teachers and or some groups of students or some group of parents or some group of schools who are asking for change and who are questioning and who are critical about the traditional education, then it makes all the sense to support them and to bring new alternatives and to bring new pedagogies. But if no one from the groups is asking for any change, then it's very difficult and it's probably not going to bring any success to start bringing change from outside, because the rest of the society considers that it's not the best pedagogy. So, so that has been helpful to us. And I also wanted to highlight the continuum that you mentioned, that sometimes it's easier to see the opposite than to see the continuum. But, and especially in contexts where there are a lot of traditional pedagogies that are very much in the authoritarian side of the continuum, then it's easier to say, no, we have to move away from that. But if we see more as a continuum, then we probably see it more like the zone of proximal development of Vygotsky's, in terms of where are you and where can you be with some additional support. I think that's very helpful from your paper and your presentation. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Enrique. Michele, maybe go back to you for a minute or two if you want to respond to anything he raised, or comment on what we saw in the chat, or there's also been a couple questions too.
There have been some questions, and I wish I had time to answer all of them, but I'll just bring what I think is an interesting example of what Enrique was talking about. I did, with colleagues from the University of Birmingham, we did some work in the Gambia in West Africa a few years ago, where we were talking about, we were doing workshops effectively on democratic education, which included a fairly hard line on corporal punishment in a context where it was still fairly normalized. And this set up a little bit of an us and them thing, Enrique, a little bit like the outsiders coming in. And that whole dynamic changed when we said that actually in the UK, the policy on corporal punishment being forbidden was imposed while the majority of people in the country were still in favor of it. And it was, so we were not from such a different place, right? We understood that there were cultural values just as there were in the UK, which actually supported corporal punishment, but that the rights base, as well as the fact that it doesn't actually achieve anything, were quite compelling. So yes, I agree with everything that you've said. And there's some really interesting questions, and I'm sorry I don't have more time to take them up, but maybe we can see how we go at the end of the session.
Yeah, I think we'll have time to get into some of them, but now let's take this conversation about certainty and uncertainty and futures, and to specifically a conversation about textbooks. So for that, we have Jim Williams and Andy Smart. Over to you two.
Can you hear me now? Good. All right. My name is Jim Williams. I'm on the faculty of the George Washington University, and I'm a co-convener of NISSEM. NISSEM is a curiously named group of international academics and practitioners who joined forces in early 2017 to promote integration of target at 4.7 themes and social emotional skills into textbooks and other educational materials, particularly in conflict-affected countries and contexts. NISSEM stands for Networking to Integrate SDG Target 4.7 and Social and Emotional Learning into Educational Materials. We are a non-hierarchical, unpaid group of 7 co-conveners and 2 associates. Please, we hope you will follow us. Next slide, please. Okay. For most of history, most children have had a difficult time of it. They may have had to look after crops, cattle, siblings. They may have had to work under hazardous conditions uprooted by war and civil conflict. Many more children are just poor. Most children have lived under conditions of uncertainty, and even today, a great number of children live in impoverished and conflict-affected settings. Traditional educational practices help children and young people transition into adult economic and social roles, but most traditional societies have been challenged, upended. Forces of colonialization, industrialization, conflict, globalization, etc. With the expansion and formalization of school across the globe, children's lives became more structured, their frames of reference broadened. The spread of schooling has resulted in a more routinized and predictable childhood for most children. Of course, certainty in education is a double-edged sword. The rigidity built into many school systems, state-authorized textbooks, for example, can work against social and political resilience. This happens when what is taught is designed to be learned without question, without opportunities for children to see connection between their learning and their lives. By seeking to remove the unforeseen from teaching and learning, this approach removes an essential element of learning. As education philosopher Geert Biesta said, if we take the risk out of education, there's a chance we take out education altogether. Looking to the future, we see that coming decades will likely be characterized by increasing fragility and uncertainty, ruptures and night's moves. Blueprints of false certainty fail to prepare students for periods of rapid change, discontinuity, and the unexpected. Next slide, please. We are convinced that preparing students for change and uncertainty is an essential task of schooling in the present time and must be integrated into the purposes and processes of schooling. Social and emotional learning, or SEL, is at the core of such a curriculum. We define SEL broadly to include social, emotional values, perspectives, and identity. Though there are some universals, the sort of teaching and learning must be contextualized in the social and economic landscape in which schools work, in the knowledge and worldview children and teachers bring to school, and in the overall curriculum and pedagogy, defined broadly as Michele did earlier. The failure of learner-centered pedagogy to take root in many educational ecologies, highlighted in Michele's message, underscores the critical importance of context. Next slide, please. SEL, we believe, contributes to sustainability of education systems and the world's broader development goals. Ideally, SEL is part of the inherent inclusiveness of the school. Properly contextualized, SEL is less an add-on than a vehicle for furthering students' content knowledge as well as their pro-social learning. To be sustainable, coordinated efforts are needed to embed these elements of national education policies into core subject disciplines, and given their centrality in guiding instruction, especially in poor contexts, into textbooks. Let me turn it over to Andy, NISSEM co-convener now.
Next slide, please. Thanks, Jim. So we are looking at textbooks and education materials, and that's particularly because we are working with low and middle income countries, although there are many countries where textbooks play a dominant role. And for many countries, the curriculum is essentially represented by a textbook. There are countries where if you say curriculum, it means national curriculum and school curriculum as separate entities. But in many countries, particularly low and middle income countries, for school practitioners, the curriculum is what is taught in the classroom, and it's represented by a textbook. So textbooks help to address the policy practice gap. So there are educational ambitions set out in policy documents, international and national policy documents, but often these are fragmented, diluted, and somehow overturned by no bridge to practice. And that's what the textbook does. It kind of provides a bridge to practice. It bridges this policy practice gap. And we are looking in our paper at issues of learning, social emotional learning, but learning both as purpose and as process. So we're looking at learning as the what and the why, but also as the how. And this picks up on a lot of what's been said already about the pedagogy of learning and how we contextualize pedagogy. And we believe that textbooks have a role in many instances in this. Next slide, please. The next couple of slides will take you through what we are proposing is a procedural way of looking at textbooks. This is for curriculum developers, this is for textbook developers. And the principle of starting with a principle of learning, which is the role of the affective in learning. And therefore, a framework which is built around the cognitive and the affective is a very sound starting place for curriculum and textbook development. So the affective or emotional dimension is a key to engaging the learner and creating that love of learning, without which learning is much harder to achieve, and it cannot be decoupled from the academic purpose. And one of the writers and thinkers that we've lent on a lot in the past few years of thinking about this is Mary Helen Imordino-Yang. And I'm going to give you word for word what she says because it's so powerful. It's literally biologically impossible to build memories, engage complex thoughts, or make meaningful decisions without emotion. So the curriculum framework needs to be turned into a textbook framework that recognizes how the affective and the cognitive support each other. And textbook writers can interpret curriculum and plan textbooks around the cognitive and affective dimensions. Next slide, please. The diagram that we're showing here places the cognitive affective framework as a boundary around areas which we've labeled strong pedagogy and strong content. So these are going to be appropriate to the subject and to the level that's of the child. And we have called them strong pedagogy and strong content because we believe that strong reflects pro-societal themes and values, and particularly Sustainable Development Goal Target 4.7. And we believe that developing strong pedagogy reflects the diversity and needs of learners and requires analyzing the reasons why rote learning is so often the default mode of teaching in many classrooms around the world. For us, the textbook has a very powerful role to play, whether for the better or for the worse, in supporting or not supporting the idea of rote learning as the default mode. But this requires teachers' professional development to develop their own social and emotional competencies to understand and employ a strong pedagogy. Next slide, please. So our paper and other Futures of Education background papers relate to educating for uncertain futures. And we have taken the view that uncertainty relates very much to complexity, that textbooks can show teachers how to open up complexity rather than close it down, and how to manage it. Because this is the fear of teachers as well as of those who set policy for teachers. Strong content, textbook content, shows how subject interconnections work and shows the implications at a social and individual level of interconnections. And strong pedagogy shows how to develop turn-taking and empathy and critical thinking and other essential dimensions of pedagogy. Textbooks can legitimize and support connected pedagogy and connected content. By legitimize, we see textbooks as an extension of policy, as policy documents that are present in the classroom. And by looking at textbooks through this lens of strong content and strong pedagogy, we believe that textbooks, even though they are a relatively narrow way of thinking about teaching and learning in the classroom, but they enable and can enable teachers to do the narrow well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy and Jim. Great. Over to you, Enrique, for some thoughts and reactions and maybe even provocations.
Yeah, I also enjoy very much this paper. I appreciate very much the way they look at textbooks as an opportunity to identify and promote what they call strong content, but at the same time send a clear message about how to work with those with that content. And the textbook is not only information, it's pedagogy, and it gives a lot of information about ways of working with that content. I also agree very much with the idea that in many contexts, and we see that in many schools in Colombia, textbooks become the curriculum. Colombia has a very decentralized educational system where the government gives very little guidance about what to teach or how to teach it. And in many places, teachers only have the textbooks, and they ended up following one of the big educational publishers in Latin America, what the publisher says that should be taught and how. So the textbooks play a crucial role. I have two comments. One is in the paper the Andy, Jim, and the colleagues mentioned that they consider that printed textbooks will remain for many years. And I'm not sure about that. I mean, we are already seeing distant, remote areas receiving tablets, for example, areas that do not have access to internet, but receive tablets in which they have all the textbooks, all the worksheets to work in class. And even if they don't have access to internet, the teachers bring the tablets to a place with internet connection once a year or once a semester. And then they update the programs, the materials they receive, they download new materials, and then they come back to the schools with those materials. And I think that's that brings a lot of opportunities. For example, one problem that we have encountered is that many teachers do not have much time to prepare their classes or to read the textbooks before the class. So we have observed teachers who during the class time with all the students in front of them, take up the textbook and start reading. They even read aloud and say, well, today class is about, and start reading, and it's sometimes it's a lot of text. So I think new technology like tablets could improve the way teachers can prepare classes, for example, by including videos, small videos in which they see, for example, an activity, and they see how the activity develops, and that helps them understand better how they can bring the pedagogy out of the activity and how to implement it in class. The second point that I wanted to make is that I think we definitely need much more pre-service teacher training on these topics, especially on social emotional learning. there are still too many schools of education in which there is very little on how teachers can manage their own emotions in stressful situations in the class, and I mean, there are many difficult situations having 30, 40, 50 students in the same classroom, and they need to have skills to deal with that. So to develop their own social emotional competencies, and for teachers to learn how to promote social emotional competencies among their students. That's happening very little, and if we want to make this a priority, it has to be a priority in all the schools of education. And here again, we have a similar dilemma with what we were talking about with respect to Michele's presentation, is that many schools of education feel that they or rightly consider themselves autonomous. So it's very hard, impossible to impose something in their curriculum, in their own curriculum or of teacher training. So we also need to work in creative ways, trying to again, build alliances among schools, alliances among professors of education, and to create new opportunities for schools of education to include social emotional learning in their training. That has to be a priority for the future. So again, I really appreciate the way you think about strong content and strong pedagogy as crucial to what we should be doing in the future. So.
Thanks very much, Enrique. I really appreciate that you raised the question of social emotional learning for teachers, because I think one of the things that's on discussion across all these papers are basically like the emotional, I mean, the affective dimension of how we orient towards certainty and uncertainty. But also like the emotional dimension of how we orient towards the future in general, right? Kind of our hopes and fears, and then how that enters into education, into our pedagogic relationships. So I'm going to bring up two questions that I think are interrelated, and ask each of the panelists, each of the teams to respond. We got a question about whether there was consensus about certain areas or topics in curriculum that lend themselves better to more fixed or more fluid approaches. And related to that, how do you approach controversial issues, right? But then there's a second question that I think relates. It's asked specifically about textbooks, but I think you can all respond. The question is, should textbooks appeal to negative as well as positive affect and emotion? So maybe invite Helen and Vidur to come in first with thoughts on that set of ideas.
Well, there's certainly a fantastic range of questions that have been generated by this discussion, and it's very exciting to think about them. I think, can you rephrase that first question again, Noah? You're saying
I mean, what
is there consensus about certain topics which lend themselves to fixed and fluid approaches? I'd rather Michele answer that question, but you're talking about the role of emotion and the issue around controversy. I think it's a very interesting question about how we use controversy. And by the way, not only in what you might call areas which are ring-fenced as moral or civic education. I think we should recognize that emotion permeates the entire curriculum, even mathematics if it's taught properly, if you like, because it could, but what does emotion mean? Are we talking about managing emotion or using emotion? I would distinguish between managing emotion, which assumes that somehow emotion is intrusive and disorganizing, rather than thinking of using emotion, which is recognizing, as you said, Mary Helen and Medina Yang's work, is that really emotion is fundamental to everything we do. And to a large extent, certainly psychology has largely ignored emotion. And in a sense, to some extent, certain areas of pedagogy have tried to dampen it down. And I'm very pleased that so many people today have said, look, we have to recognize and deal with and use emotion effectively. And in the case of controversy, the point about controversy, it always arouses emotion. So how do we use it productively? Whether we're doing it in geography or in history or in literature or in science, in thinking about scientific methods, scientific developments. I think we need to step back really as educators and think much more fundamentally about the way we have separated affect and cognition, going back to Descartes, basically. And I think that's a fundamental thing we need to bring in, and dealing with controversy is a way into saying, okay, how do we deal with emotion? Not just emotion responses, but the way that emotion informs positively as well as negatively our commitments to particular positions.
Vidur, do you want to add anything, or should we go to Michele next?
No, go ahead, just in the interest of time.
Thanks. Yeah, lots and lots of interesting questions. I will pick up on this fixed versus fluid question, because I think that some disciplines maybe do lend themselves a little bit more to one end of the continuum than the other. So, for example, if one is studying COVID-19, right, there is a particular body of scientific knowledge about how viruses are transmitted, how vaccines work, that has evolved over time and may change in the future. And there may be some points of controversy within it, but largely there's some very valuable content that people, could usefully know in order to understand that. But the political choices around how we manage an epidemic is a much more controversial, much more fluid territory. And so perhaps you might argue that, hard science versus civics might be, an area where one might be seen as more fixed and one might be seen as more fluid. But in reality, either can be taught either way. Exactly. I have certainly seen civics curricula, which are about how many seats are there in the House of Representatives and is this on the exam and therefore we're going to learn it. And I have also seen science lessons and curricula which focus on the process of the scientific method and how science evolves and how scientists constantly have to critically question their own judgment in order to move the field forward. So while maybe there is some space for arguing that particular disciplines lend themselves, all of them can be taught either way. And so it's important to think about the consequences of teaching something in a particular way. I think when it comes to controversial issues, one of the big challenges comes when you have diversity within nations or within localities, as Enrique was talking about. So for example, the controversy in the UK, specifically in Birmingham, which is a very, very diverse city, around the sex education curriculum. And particular families from different religious backgrounds objecting to certain contents, for example, about homosexuality or whatever, and how you manage that intranational diversity sensitively in handling controversial subjects is, I think, incredibly important. I'm not going to give an easy answer to that because there isn't one that would be facile, but I think these are really important questions for educators to think about.
Thanks, Michele. Over to you, Andy and Jim, or Jim. And you're going to need to unmute. Yep.
One thing I wanted to remark on in terms of different ways of teaching science, I really enjoyed a few years ago reading Bill Bryson's Short History of Nearly Everything. If anybody has read that, you might have remembered in the opening pages, he talks about why he wrote this book, which is a sort of story of science, slightly Western oriented, I would say, but it's a good story. And he says that that he was totally bored by science, and he gives an example from his textbook, from his school textbook, and that's how he starts the book off, as to why he was bored by science, and then he goes into the whole story of how science knowledge was created, and that these were human constructs. They become knowledge, but they are human constructs which develop through history. In terms of controversy and how to teach controversial issues through textbooks, I think with centralized systems where it's a centrally written textbook or a centrally approved textbook, then the starting point is when the text is written, researched and written, or when the guidelines are set, because it's incumbent on those policy makers to address what is controversial and to help guide and support teachers to be able to teach that subject, rather than dictating a single message through learning lines of text from a textbook page. It's to say, here are issues we're trying to teach: critical literacy, or we're trying to teach diversity, and we've said this is important, and now we're saying that the textbooks need to do this. We need to give some guidelines in the textbook and in the teacher's resources as to how this might be handled. Some areas will be highly controversial, and Michele just gave an example from the UK, teaching sex education, and there will be controversial areas in every context. But I think we can help policymakers to help teachers by using the textbooks in a very different way. Through this strong content, strong pedagogy.
Okay, may I jump in for a second?
You or the bear can also speak.
I'm sorry.
This is a more than human webinar. Your companion there, Jim.
Okay, good. Oh yes, the bear. Oh yes, that bear. Forgot about that. There's also the unicorn behind. So on the issue of controversy, that's enormously important, and there are no easy answers. Gingerly, contextually, controversy, and maybe not directly, indirectly. There are pedagogies that are being developed that we know about to help teach controversial subjects. They're somewhat teacher intensive, teacher training intensive, and they require certain agility of mind and distance from the controversies for teachers to be able to do it. But there are some pedagogies being developed to do that. It's always good to appeal to ideals. Every country has ideals, and sometimes they're shared, often they're shared. And so that's an indirect way to build the kind of skills, the multiple perspectivity and such that teaching can do, all of which lays the groundwork for approaching controversy. Sometimes it has to be approached indirectly through controversies in other places, and let teachers and students make the connections. So lots of thinking about that, but I don't want to take any more time.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everyone. Okay, we've just got a couple of minutes left, and as most of you know, this is the second time we've brought these people together. They've listened to each other now twice. Let's try having each of you take a quick opportunity to ask the other a question. So pick whoever you want to ask a question of. Helen or Vidur, do you want to start off with a question for one of the other presenters? Something that's been on your mind, either provoked today by the chat or at the last session.
Sure.
Vidur, it's your turn.
Sure, thank you. So I have a question for Michele and maybe for Andy and Jim as well. And so one of the things, Michele, that you spoke about is that we see fewer sort of knights moves in pedagogy and in change. And I'm wondering what you think about the role of the tools that are given that sort of enable changes in pedagogy. So whether that be sort of broader political or policy level tools that can enable that or not, or as we think about sort of textbooks at the other end, and of course the big T that everybody's talking about now with COVID is technology. And how do we think about these different tools or these different levels in the ways that they can create sort of changes in pedagogy or not, for that fact?
Yeah, as I've said, pedagogy is incredibly resilient and difficult to change, but it does change. I mean, the pace tends to be slow. You know, it tends to be across generations rather than very sudden shifts. There are ways of changing. pedagogy, one of the quickest and most effective and influential ways is by changing assessment. So if if something is an examined subject and very high stakes and stops being an examined subject with very high stakes, you open up spaces, and the opposite is also true. You very heavy-handed accountability structures and regimes can change pedagogy. If inspections are very heavy-handed and have serious consequences for teachers and schools. These are not particularly positive examples in my books. I think in terms of the kinds of change that we're talking about here, which are about a visionary change towards a more positive future, I think that a lot of it is aligned very closely with social change. You know, my parents had a very different relationship with their teachers than I had with mine, and the next generation, there's a shift there as well. But this is not an artifact of policy. This mirrors other changes in society, and to me, that's when pedagogical change is most effective, when it kind of moves in tandem with social change. And one of the problems is that pedagogy is often a little bit behind social change. So I think, yeah, that would be my answer. There are weak levers and strong levers, and then alignments, perhaps constellations that work more effectively.
Michele, do you want to pass the torch by asking a question of one of the other groups?
Sure. Well, I guess my question's to Andy and Jim, but it kind of emerges from Helen and Vidur's presentation. I mean, how do you deal with Knight's moves in social Knight's moves in textbooks? Because it's particularly a printed textbook is often, gosh, they sit in classrooms for years and years and years and years, and in a year's time, it's going to be the post-COVID kids, and they'll have the same old textbooks probably.
That was my question to Helen and Vidur. I don't know. Maybe Andy does. But perhaps this is a good use of history in talking about past transitions and how, and science actually, in terms of climate science and such. Actually, maybe for many of the subjects, now that I start winding down this path, many subjects provide a way to talk about change as not something, as a somewhat permanent fixture, and to look forward in past changes and how they have been responded to. Would be one idea.
Yeah, I will add something. I mean, I think change, it is very much a double-edged sword, and teachers around the world, they spend their time thinking about, oh no, not another change. We've had enough change already. But I want to pick up on something that was mentioned in the chat or in the Q&A, which is, the sort of ideas about change that are fed by changes in digital technology. And I think, Enrique, also you mentioned this. So what the digital textbook might do in the classroom, I think, yeah, unquestionably it makes changes, but not necessarily the anticipated changes. And I think this is where thinking through process of change that Helen and Vidur have talked about, because changing the technology itself doesn't change the pedagogy necessarily. It may change other things. And if your starting point is that the pedagogy is the underlying structure of what happens in the classroom, then whether it's digital or print-based isn't necessarily going to make a difference there. So there may be a Knight's move that's not quite the expected Knight's move because of the digital technology, and that may be because of the sudden amount of resources that are being made available to buy this technology has other implications, policy implications, but may not necessarily make a difference to teaching and learning practice. That's a complicated answer, I know, but it's the best I can do.
Thanks, Andy. I think the question's coming back to you, Helen. Just a final word, your thoughts on this, and then we'll go to Enrique for just also a very final word. A
couple of points, I think. I mean, we talk about controversy. Of course, one thing we need to do is to make some things controversial and not now controversial. A lot of change and development in any field arises because we suddenly realize that something we've taken for granted as normal suddenly becomes abnormal or unnormal or non-predictable. And I'm thinking what we've learned from COVID. I mean, COVID has taught us that many of the things we took for granted in the classroom are no longer taken for granted. I mean, I think Andy is right that to some extent technology doesn't change things, but I think worldwide, the experience of teaching outside the classroom, teaching in the various ways we've all struggled to, I think that must have an effect on how every teacher and every pupil thinks about what it means to be taught and to teach. So I think making things controversial that were not formally even seen as controversial is a pretty important step in change everywhere.
Thanks, Helen. Indeed, I mean, COVID has changed things at a faster pace than we ever thought imaginable, right? I think that's if there's a useful lesson, that might be one. Enrique, a final word, and then while you're talking, maybe Vidur, you can put up the slide with all our emails. We'll be posting the recording and posting the presentation, invite you all to get in touch. And then after Enrique, we'll also invite you to fill out a feedback, a survey, webinar survey. So over to you, Enrique.
I just wanted to say that this has been a wonderful discussion, and I think it makes us think about the future in a structured way, gives a framework to think about the future, but I guess most importantly, it makes us think about what we should be doing right now. So it's about the future, but it's especially about the present, about what we should be doing right now, wherever we are. So thank you very much for this.
Yeah, Enrique, that point really resonates with some of the futures literacy work that's done at UNESCO, which really emphasizes the idea that, you know, we envision, we work with, we inhabit, you know, multiple alternative futures for the purpose of coming back to the present and thinking about our options and our range of possibilities. So again, we'll be putting this presentation recording and the slides online. Please feel free to get in touch with any of the panelists. Thank you all. A round of applause for the fantastic contributions and conversation we've had today. And then we'll just put in the chat the link to this survey. I think I got that there. Oops, I put it wrong. Let me do it this way. We would love to get, okay, there we go. We've got it. Thanks, everyone, for joining today, and look forward to having you at future events put together with Teachers College, NISSEM, and UNESCO. Take care, everyone. We're going to leave the slide up with the links for the next little bit, and the presenters will follow up together offline. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Noah, Helen, Andy, Michelle, Enrique, Vidur, Kim. I think that's everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. The panelists could just stay back for a few minutes before we officially close while the participants leave.
Are we still online?
We're still broadcasting, yes. Rudy, thanks a lot for all the TC/IT support. It's been fantastic, both this webinar and the previous one.
Yeah, here. No problem.
Absolutely.
Great panel as well. I'm actually just being called right now to another meeting at the moment.